share a Coke with a friend. Okay, let's get started here. Chapter 3, these are the 4 main points that we're going to cover today. You have the colonial population. Oops, let's get that off there. The colonial population, the colonial economy, patterns of society, and you have in there the last one, the awakening and the enlightenment. I'm going to go through the first couple parts relatively quick just because, we covered it in class today. If you have any other questions, we can discuss it. First off, let's move this ahead. This map you can find on page 68 of your book. It just shows you the biggest centers of population throughout the country. And the brown area over here is where areas of non-Indian settlements. So you can see we're starting to spread a little bit bigger now. We're still very small, compact, but we're moving westward. Okay, natural increase indentured servitude. Young men and women bound themselves to the masters for a fixed period of time. After that, they received head rights. In the 1670s, the flow began to decline because of prosperity in England, and also there was a decrease in the birth rate as well. So very quickly there. The birth and death rates. There was inadequate food. There was definitely frequent epidemics. There was large numbers of early deaths, but growth of the population even after the immigration occurred. And at the 1650s, the natural increase was had the most growth there. The northern, if you want to look at the New England side, the north was a cool climate, relatively disease-free, had clean water, had no large population centers for epidemics, which equaled a little bit longer life expectancy. The south mortality rates were high for infants as well. Life expectancy was low. Diseases in salt-contaminated water were an issue, and there definitely was a growth because of the immigration. And finally, by the late 17th century, ratio of males to females becoming more balanced led to a lot more increased natural growth, which was with the same sex rate, with the balanced ratio. So that was very important. Medicine in the colonies, midwives, I should say. There was no concept of infection, sterilization. Midwives and childbirth are recommended herbs for women to take. Let's move on there. This graph just shows the non-Indian population of North America. This is in thousands, so 251,000 in 1700. And you can see the increase all the way to 1780. Now, women and families in the Chesapeake. Well, we went over a lot of this already in class, but women married young. They had high mortality rates. Premarital sex was common. Life of childbearing average was 8 women, 5 of which typically died in childhood or infancy. The high mortality rates led to many orphans, special courts and institutions to protect them and control them. By the 18th century, life expectancy was increasing in indentured servitude, decreasing in more equal sex ratio was easier life for whites. In New England, family structures were a lot more stable, very traditional, very patriarchal Puritan family. The women minority married young. Children were more likely to survive, better medical care. Much of the life was spent rearing and childbearing, and family relationships were in women's status that were dictated by the religion of the family. Slavery in North America. Demand for black servants to supplement scarce southern labor supply was in need. The Atlantic slave trade did not serve just the American colonies. Portuguese was sent to South America and the Caribbean. By the late 17th century, came to America with the French and the Dutch. The sugar economies of the Caribbean and Brazil demanded slaves because of the amount of time it took to cultivate that crop. Assumptions were the white race was superior. Slave codes limited the rights of blacks in law, and almost absolute authority were onto their masters. And then lastly, for the colonial population, early immigrants, 18th century immigration from England that was in the decline. French Huguenots, German Protestants settled in New York and Pennsylvania. In around 1710, the Scots and the Irish emigrated, and there was a significant in New Jersey and Pennsylvania as well, and established Presbyterianism as the main religion in those areas. So, colonial economies. The southern economy was basically agrarian. It was based on agriculture and farming, rice, tobacco, indigo. In South Carolina and Georgia, rice was the staple crop. Because of the South's dependence on the cash crops, developed less of a commercial and industrial economy, few cities, and there was really no large merchant community, comparing that to the North, where it was all large merchant communities. Agriculture dominated, but more diverse, but conditions were less favorable. Home industries, craftsmen, artisans, and mills for grinding grain, large-scale shipbuilding operations also happened in the North. People lacked guns, plows, lacked ownership of tools because of poverty and isolation in the North as well. Ability for people to require manufactured implements lagged behind the capacity to produce them. That's why we needed Europe to survive, and that's where this triangle trade route comes in page 82 of your book. The rise of the commerce. We traded rum, sugar, slaves for manufactured goods. The new merchant class developed in port cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, and they were protected from competition by the Navigation Acts. The rise of consumerism. This was a growing prosperity created the appetite to ability to satisfy material goods. There was definitely an increasing division of societies by class. Ability to purchase and show goods were important to demonstrate the class, and that's even that way still today. Industrial revolutions allowed England and Europe to produce more affordable goods than we could in the United States, in the colonies, the English colonies. And growth of consumption and refinement led to cities to plan growth and ensure public spaces for parks and public stages and social displays. Patterns of society. This will be up through page 90 after we get through patterns of society. And really, this whole part is about the Puritan community, the plantation lifestyle, and the idea of the witchcraft phenomenon. So, some plantations were enormous, others were relatively smaller. The economy, the Goodyear's growers could earn a profit and expand, but couldn't control the markets, and when prices fell, they were ruined for the most part. Most plantations were far from towns, and it forced them to be self-contained communities. Some larger ones approached the size of a town. The Stonewall Rebellion was really the first slave revolt in South Carolina in 1739, where 100 slaves rose up and attempted to flee to Florida, but they were basically quickly crushed by the whites, and other slaves tried to run away as well. Some slaves learned skills, set up their own shops, and some of them even tried to buy their freedom. The Puritan community was a social unit of the Northeast, was the town, the covenant, members of the bound all to religion and to social commitment and unity. They were a patriarchal society, weakened by economic necessity. They were tight-knit communities controlled by the layout, power of the church, and the town meeting for the most part. So the church was really the backbone of the society. Moving on to the witchcraft. Salem, Massachusetts was by far the hotbed of where this occurred, and the accusation spread from Indians to prominent people. This model would repeat itself in mostly middle-aged, childless, widowed women who may have inherited poverty or property. Puritan society with no tolerance to any independent women. So if you were seen doing something a little bit different, if you're a little weird, you were going to be considered to be a witch, and the witchcraft idea became pretty mainstream. Cities, growth of the colonial cities. Commercial centers emerged along the Atlantic seaboard, eastern coast, from New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Charlestown, and Newport, Rhode Island. Trading centers for farmers, leaders, and merchants and large-scale estates. Large social distinctions were between each city. And the center of the industry, such as the ironworks and distilleries, were big. Advanced schools like colleges and like Harvard and those places, and a lot of different cultural activities. They were vulnerable to fluctuations of trade. Countryside effects were muted for the most part in places where new ideas could circulate, regular newspapers could circulate, and books from abroad just equaled a lot more ideas into the city lifestyle compared to the countryside where farming was taking place. Okay, the Enlightenment. and the Great Awakening. There was definitely a lot of different patterns during the time period. Religious toleration flourished in America because of necessity. The Church of England was the official religion of some counties, ignored except in Virginia and Massachusetts. Protestants extended their tolerations more rapidly to each other than to Roman Catholics persecuted in Massachusetts. The Great Awakening was basically the old lights versus the new lights, and it began in the 1730s and climaxed by 1740s, which was a new spirit of religious fervor. It was an appeal to women and younger sons because of the rhetoric of potential for every person to break away from the constraints and renew the relationship with God. People like John and Charles Wesley, George Whitefield spread the revival, and the most famous Northeastern Congregationalist was Jonathan Edwards, who we will read about tomorrow in class. The Enlightenment was very traditional. It was a change of tradition, I should say. A product of great scientific and intellectual discoveries in the 17th century. Natural laws discovered that regulated nature, celebrated human reason and inquiry. People should look at themselves for guidance to live and shape society, not to God. Didn't challenge religion, but insisted rational inquiry and supported Christianity. And then lastly, education. 6 colleges were founded by 1763. Harvard by the Puritans that was used to train ministers. William and Mary, Yale. A lot of the Ivy League schools were created at this point in time. And then lastly, Massachusetts law in 1647 required to have each town have a public school, and most white males were literate, and Africans virtually had no access to education. So that's it for chapter 3, and I will see you guys tomorrow.